A long time ago, there was a man who was a taxidermist. As a boy, he was particularly cruel to his schoolmates, often cutting them with scissors. He was particularly fond of scissors, and it was said that he was never seen without a pair or two sticking out of a pocket or swinging around his finger, all the way from when he was a little boy up until he inherited his father's fortune. The taxidermist's father was a very wealthy man. He owned a factory in New England back during the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. The factory made clothing, and over time he became a very prosperous person. But this man never made time for his family, and his family, at least after his wife's untimely death, grew up without him. But there were always ample scissors lying around, and ample opportunities to use them. Anyone who worked in these factories had no choice but to enable the young boy. The boy was fond of buying animals at the local shops, starting with birds and mice and moving his way up to cats. The boy was fond of keeping the animals locked away in cages in his basement until they starved to death, so he could dissect their bodies and see what they were made of. Eventually, he moved on to using poisons, as they left the bodies less dried out. As money was not an obstacle, the taxidermist moved on to larger and more exotic specimens, and it was not long before his indulgences were too expensive to be kept private. After his father died, the taxidermist had no interest in textiles, and so he sold off the family company and rested on a fortune more than adequate to comfort him the rest of his life. But money was of no interest to him, as it had never been. He was driven by his passion, and his passion was in death. The taxidermist was known to buy large tracts of land by which he could hunt game at any time of the year, simply to add to the ever-growing piles of fodder of his increasingly morbid art. He worked with raccoons and skunks and deer, but when lucky enough, as there were no such laws protecting endangered animals at the time, he especially loved to work with the flesh and blood of wolves. It was actually his work with wolves that drew the most public attention, specifically because of how eccentric his usage of their carcasses became. The taxidermist had a certain penchant with wolves, perhaps because of their predatory nature, or perhaps because of the long-standing mythology and lore that wolves have with humankind. Or perhaps it was simple anger or jealousy, as even a wolf, devoid of language or society or culture, could naturally maintain dignity and trust and care for one's own kind that he had so completely failed at. His motives for his preference for wolves remained unknown, but their results stood for themselves. He would often combine several bodies, often dozens of wolves, into a work that was, as described by one art critic at a gallery opening, an indignation of anything left holy in this world. The wolves, if one could even call them that by the end of the sculpture, were rearranged into some of the most horrific and surreal displays known to the early 20th century. The sculptures often depicted teeth and eyes propped out of places where, to quote again from that long-deceased critic, they had abhorrently no bodily functions, many of which seemed to defy gravity and, on their own accord, could not exist in our natural world, and so were therefore propped up by wires and coils. These bizarre art displays featured only the bodies and furs of wolves, never other animals mixed into the chaos. If these strange displays showed any insight into the mind of their creator, it went undetected by their viewers. Over time, the taxidermist's reputation grew far and wide, his traditional works being so realistic, so pseudo-natural, so pure and encapsulating that lifelike quality of his subjects, that only the wealthiest of collectors could afford the privilege of one of his prized works joining their collection. The taxidermist never interacted directly with his customers. He had a handful of handlers who would come to his home estate, enter the barn, and take out the already boxed and crated works to their owners. Then one day, the boxes stopped appearing. His handlers continued to ship his animals, unaware that anything had changed. More than a week passed, and no one knew what had happened to the taxidermist, and his business associates, the few that he had, continued to sell his products to those clients who were willing to pay top dollar. But when the orders piled up and the products ran out, people began to wonder what was going on. The taxidermist's mansion was locked from the inside when men finally entered, and there had not been any smoke seen coming out of the chimney for days. When they entered the home, they found everything intact. There were no notes or letters indicating any sort of traveling, no signs of clothes gone or bags packed, and no signs of a break-in or foul play of any kind. All that they found were a dozen or so crates in the taxidermist's basement workshop, and so they brought them up and shipped them out. It was so cold in the middle of January that it wasn't until the first or second package got to its owner that someone first complained about the smell. Soon all the orders that had been found packed in the taxidermist's basement were returned except for one. That animal, a great black tundra wolf, caused such disgust in its new owner that he took it upon himself to reopen the animal and see if he could adjust the stuffing himself. Inside the wolf, he found a few rotting pieces of intestine, what appeared to be a sinew of flesh about 2 feet long, and a particularly well-preserved human hand. All of the rest of the returned animals were investigated by the police, as much of the taxidermist's body that was ever recovered was then found. All the taxidermist's scissors were found lined up in perfect order on his workbench. There were no fingerprints in any of them, but the criminal detective could not find any telltale signs of them being wiped down to remove evidence. As the death of the taxidermist happened many years before the advent of DNA testing, the only blood found in the tools could not be positively matched to the taxidermist. But by use of early microscopes, it was determined that all blood samples taken from the scissors came from a source that could not be identified as human or animal. Today, what is left of the taxidermist estate has been broken up. Most of his hunting fields have become parks and preserves. Few of his specimens survive to this day, and after his untimely death, all of his works that were most politely described as abstract were destroyed. That is, if any exist today, they are not being publicly displayed. It is not known exactly on what day the taxidermist was killed, but to this day, on every full moon between the end of January and the beginning of February, people say that animals gather at the spot where the taxidermist's mansion once stood. Deer, rabbits, possums, and raccoons. Even predators like foxes congregate and do not harm one another. And some people say that if you get close enough to the spot without scaring off the animals, you can still hear the howl of wolves that have not been seen in that place for hundreds of years.